In this video, I'm talking about Hexbound, which is a 5e campaign supplement from Hit Point Press. I kickstarted this book, this campaign supplement, in 2021, I believe, and it was finally delivered probably, I think the hardback was finally delivered in 2024. And I have to say, in that intervening time, as people who kickstart a lot of things will understand, I had kind of stopped caring about the final product. I'd received the PDF and I'd kind of gone through it. It didn't hold my interest. And to be honest, I sort of wrote this thing off. But first, I want to tell you about why I kickstarted it. At the time, in 2020, I was running a D&D game every week with my niece, who was at the time 9 years old. So with her and her friends, who are all around the same age, obviously their entrance points to fantasy were witches, Harry Potter, myth, and folklore. After that campaign ended, and Hit Point Press announced this Kickstarter, which was just around the same time, I jumped on it because I thought this is a great way to get young people involved in this and play a trope, a fantasy trope that they understand. And certainly because 5e Dungeons & Dragons does not have a witch class, this seemed to fill a gap that was needed. But I didn't really have a lot of expectations other than knowing the reputation of Hit Point Press. They created the Humblewood campaign setting, which I really enjoyed. In fact, that was where I was playing with that group of young people. We were playing the Humblewood adventure that's in the first Humblewood book. I've since gone on to back the other Humblewood projects. I think it's so cool. I've also just been a big fan of Hit Point Press, their Big Bads project, which you should look into. I've run tons of those Big Bads at tables, and I have their Deck of Many Things, which I think is the first project they put together. I say that because most Hit Point Press content sort of walks this fine line of serious 5e content and whimsical and fantastic. It's just right in the sweet spot for me. It's never too silly, but it sort of nods to silliness. So the product itself is super beautiful and just really high quality. The art is lovely. Everything about this feels like a D&D retail book, just like the Wizards of the Coast quality. I like the art even more, of course. It's just a really solid book. And I thought I would take you through the different sections of it. It's basically divided into three parts. The first is for the players. To be honest, when I got that PDF, and one of the reasons my sort of interest in this waned until I received the hardback copy of it, was because it doesn't present a witch class. And that immediately struck me as odd. Like, why only witch subclasses? Why not a witch class? I thought that was sort of the obvious way to go. And only in preparing for this video and revisiting the book, and after I got the book and sort of read through it, did I understand the reason they did subclasses is because this gives such a perfect way to put together your own coven, where you can balance out a party having the normal roles you would have, wizard, thief, fighter, but each of them subclassing into that witch subclass and thereby creating a coven which is going to strengthen all of your magic casting abilities. So for the players, as I mentioned, they have a subclass for each class. There are a couple of those that I wanted to highlight that I just think are awesome. Of course, Druid subclass, which is called the Circle of the Brew, as they mention, is like the place where a lot of people over the years who wanted to play a witch started out sort of multi-classing in Wizard and Druid or something akin to that. To get that witch flavor, we went to Druids immediately. This you'll see right here on the page. This is a bit of lore that carries through every subclass, which is that every witch has some kind of mark on their body called the witch mark. This is just a piece of lore that they invented here that I think is perfectly flavorful, and it's not a thing that constrains players' imaginations. If anything, it sort of unbinds it so that they can think a little bit more about their witch mark and how it appears on their body, and perhaps how it moves around their body, which is something that Hexbound specifies. As witches increase in power, this witch mark may actually change location on their body. So yeah, the Druid class or subclass I think is super cool. It is focused on the brewing, the Circle of the Brew. So they have these like refined brew of wild shape, and the Master Brewer, like everything's around that brewing and that cauldrons. It fits perfectly with witches. I really like that. Another subclass I wanted to point out is Rangers. I think Rangers get a bad rap in 5e. I'm not here to debate the technicalities of it. I like Rangers, and I think it's another class that goes really well with a witch subclass. And especially because of all the familiar use you're going to get with it and just that nature theme of witches. So the Coven Conclave for Rangers, I think, is a cool option. Right after that, I think this is also one of the cool ones, which is the Duskwalker archetype for rogues. I like that idea of a rogue having a witch subclass, specifically because I think some combination of this, not necessarily Druid, Ranger, and Rogue, but certainly any of those classes using the witch subclass is going to enhance a party and just give it kind of a cool flavor to its adventures. In this players section, they also have spells. Oh, I skipped a section, which is the backgrounds. The backgrounds they're great. They're fine. One thing to point out in the backgrounds that perfectly illustrates that Hit Point Press bit of whimsy and serious 5e flavor is something like the Nanny background, which has the spoonful of sugar feature. That's just sort of the line they're walking, like drawing from pop culture that anyone of any age is going to understand, but putting it into a 5e like seriousness. So I went to, in the players section, talking about the familiars, which they put in there as well. This is a pretty cool idea. They've provided some familiars which are understandable but still weird. The weatherfish, the jackalope, the dog remnant. I think all of these, in keeping with my comments in the rest of the book, are perfectly in flavor, but just a little bit weird. They, of course, have some new spells, which also walk that line of whimsy and seriousness, the toil and trouble, the cauldron bubble, the astral reading. I think all of these are like great flavor. And, I got to say, I didn't do a deep read on these. I'm not into trying to balance out every feature that gets added to a D&D game. But nothing struck me as overpowered or something that I wouldn't allow at my table. Then the second section is for dungeon masters or game masters. And this was the part when I got this hard copy of the book when I thought, okay, they've won me over. This is full of whimsy and weirdness. The magic items are largely potions, but they are goofy enough and powerful enough that I would love to sneak them into any kind of campaign, not just like a witch-themed one, and just see what kind of chaos the players can come up with on that. Likewise, they have a great wands section where the wands themselves are magic items. This is in contrast to something like the Kids on Brooms RPG, where the wands are just offer a little bit of power to certain kinds of spells. In here, they've envisioned the wands as like their own magic item, which I think is a great thing for witches to strive to achieve and pull one of those into a campaign and just see what kind of chaos it's going to bring. Some of them are goofy. The Wand of Undying Hellfire, which you can see is just an electric match. The Wand of Pillows, which is pretty funny. Some of them are pretty nasty, actually. They have another section which, again, walks that line of whimsy, zaniness, which is the hats section. Again, more magic items I would allow at my table. I tend to play with a lot of people who want that goofiness in their D&D game, even when it's high stakes or a lot of violent monsters and things like that. But these are the kind of things that I could probably introduce into a game to give it a little bit of goofiness that the players are going to appreciate, but they're still going to find a use for. The third section of this book is 4 different adventures. They somewhat strangely take you from like first level to up to a third level, and then there's another adventure that takes you from 4th to 6th, I believe. And then there's a big gap and it takes you to 10th level. I think their heart is in the right place here. I think it's a great idea. They are trying to walk you through how to create stories using these witch subclasses, how to create stories with the covens. But I think it's too much. There's too much to read here. And I'm putting myself in the head of those young players that I've played with who are eager to play with witches. This is probably a great inroad to getting them into D&D, is to give them like witch subclasses to play with and stuff like that. If they hit this section on adventures, they would just stop them dead in their tracks. Let me put that in another context. So much of the front of this book, when I talk about it mixing the whimsy of Hit Point Press's general attitude with the seriousness of 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons, so much of it seems to be written at like a level where you could understand it in grade school. Then you're going to hit this adventure, and it's not that it's written more complicatedly. It's not more complex. It's not written poorly at all. It's just that it is so much. And this is a series of other videos that I could make, which my opinion is that this is probably a 5e problem, not a hexbound problem. They've written sort of the easiest adventure to get into for 5e, maybe, but it's still too much. I would much prefer to see the same things like this, descriptions, dialogue, but just so many more shorter bullet points. Like, I don't need a long paragraph about mannerisms or history. Just give me a bullet point. Horatio is soft-spoken, smiles a lot, troubled by his current circumstances. That's 3 bullets that just tell you about Hortensio, and I don't need to read another paragraph. This suffers from that wall of text problem that all 5e adventures suffer from for me, which is you as the DM have to read the entire thing and sort of integrate it into how you're going to tell that story at your table. I mean, I can't imagine. I would just have a pile of index cards telling me how I'm going to run this thing. And as an example of that, I also think the Humblewood adventure that's in the first book is great, but I rewrote that extensively with my players, and because I was playing with young players, I just was chopping out huge sections of it and making up the majority of what we did on the fly. Only sort of the larger encounters may have remained as the touchstones. That said, like, basically, I don't see myself using any of these adventures. I would if a young player wanted me to teach them how to run these adventures. Sure, I would go into it, but it doesn't do it for me. And likewise, one of those criticisms I have of this section is, let me see if I can find one. They have these like beautifully drawn maps that are drawn in that really popular VTT style of like a top-down bird's eye view battle map. But what's the point of them being in a book like this? Like, this isn't in a scale where I could put minis on this book and play out a battle, but it's also not as easily exportable in any way from the PDF. I believe possibly I have files for these, but why print them in the book? That starts to feel to me like they just needed some filler in here and that they didn't want to put out a shorter product. And maybe that's why the adventures are in here as well. I think they were promised in the Kickstarter, they were envisioned, but to me it's just kind of like filler. Like, give me those subclasses, give me those magic items, give me those spells, and give me some beasts, some monsters. Because in this, some of the monsters that come up in these adventures, I think, are super creative and fun. The Mandragora seedling and the larger Mandragora are super weird. I would love to play those in a game. I love the layer actions, everything with them. But the adventure itself, I'm just not going to care about. Oh my God, I'm just now seeing like all these trials of whatever. This was the one where they're training you to achieve your subclass of witch. But as you can see, as I'm flipping through, hopefully you're seeing that the art is really engaging and visual. It just like really speaks to me. Like, it's kind of scratches me where I itch in terms of 5e content, not being overly video gamey and 3D and being more sort of comic booky. But yeah, I would happily pull out beasts and NPCs from here, but I'm not going to run these adventures. And that is Hexbound. Although I may have ended on some criticism there, I do think this is such a beautiful book. I would absolutely buy it for certainly for any young person who's getting into D&D, where you're trying to teach them 5e and they need an inroad to it from popular culture that they understand. That's Hexbound.